Welcome to my channel. I'm Trish, maker behind Trish Stitched. Today's tutorial is turning a table runner into a fabric basket, or in my case, an Easter basket for my daughter. For this project, I'm using a 72-inch long embroidered table runner, found secondhand on Poshmark. A full list of required project materials are in the description below, along with a link to a written blog post with photos. So let's get into this project. First, seam rip open the table runner, separating the lining from the main. Set aside any decorative elements. You may be able to add them back in later on. Iron both pieces of fabric. My table runner already has a layer of lightweight interfacing on both pieces, and if your runner doesn't include that, I definitely recommend adding it on. Next, measure the height of the basket. I want my basket to be as high as my border design, and I'm adding a seam allowance of 1/2 inch to this measurement. Measure this height across the top and cut. I cut 1 inch off the bottom of my design to make my basket a little shorter while keeping the full design intact. This can also be helpful if your raw edge isn't completely even. My final piece of fabric measures 13¼ inch high by 14 inches wide. Next, I'm cutting that same measurement from another main piece of fabric, which will be the back of the basket. Since my table runner is 72 inches long, I have enough material to make 2 baskets, but you can also use the border print on both front and back. With right sides together, stitch the front and the back of the basket along one side seam. Again, I'm working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Press the seam open. This next step is optional, but I find it helpful along the way to baste a 1/2 inch stitch around the fabric. This makes it easier to place the foam, and it can be easier to guide your stitching later on in the sewing steps. Next, measure the total piece of fabric to cut out foam. I am cutting a piece 1 inch less than my fabric. My fabric measures 13¼ inches by 27 inches, so my foam is 12¼ inches by 26 inches. I find foam is best for this project to easily stand the basket up. Batting can be used, but the basket won't hold its shape as well. The foam I'm working with is Pellon Flex Foam. Place foam onto the wrong side of the fabric, keeping it within the basting stitching. I am stitching in the ditch on the seam allowance to hold my foam into place. Next, baste the foam to the fabric, stitching the foam 1/2 inch in on the fabric. With right sides together, stitch the other side seam. Next, cut out the basket lining. Remeasure the basket from the fold to the raw edge. Since my basket height does not exceed the fabric width, I can cut one continuous lining piece. If you are making a larger basket, you may have to cut 2 pieces of lining and stitch together, just like with our main fabric. If you need to cut 2 pieces, be sure to include seam allowance in your measurements. Fold the lining right sides together and stitch. Next, measure for the bottom circle of the basket by finding the 1/4 length of the fabric half. I find it helpful to use a fabric tape measure where you can fold and measure each 1/4. My folded basket is 13½ inches, divided by 2 is 6¾ inches, and divide that by 2 is 3�3/8 inches. To this measurement, add 1 inch. Draw a center point on a piece of paper and mark your measurement continually around the center to make your circle. In this video, I started with my original measurement and then added 1 inch, but you can add the 1 inch to your measurement from the beginning of drawing your circle. Use the template to cut one circle from the lining fabric and one circle from the main fabric. Cut the foam minus a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just like on the basket body, baste a 1/2 inch around the main fabric circle before stitching on the foam. For the bottom of the basket, stitch the foam in place. Since it's the bottom, you won't see the stitch and it will keep the foam from moving around over time. Next, pin or mark 4 even points of the circle. You can do this by folding the circle in half for the first 2 points, then fold on those points to get the next 2. These points will line up with our basket as the 2 side seams and the halfway points. Pin the bottom to the body with the right sides together. Repeat those steps for your lining pieces, making sure to pin right sides together. Stitch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both lining and main fabric. I recommend having a lot of pins to hold the fabric in place and sewing slowly around the circle, stopping and adjusting your material every so often. Next, cut out some handles. I am using 1 inch cotton webbing, and I cut my handles at 15.5 inches long. You can make your handles longer or shorter, it just kind of depends on how you like it looking against the edge of the basket. On each side seam, mark 2 inches away from the seam. This is where our straps will sit. Baste them in place. With the basket wrong sides out, insert lining right side out so both right sides are together. Match the side seams. I put a pin where the second side seam should be to match with the second side seam of the basket. Pin or clip right sides together and leave a few inches free on the back of the basket. Stitch together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Using the opening on the basket, turn the fabric right sides out. Gently press the seam down and fold remaining seam allowance. If you made a basting stitch in the beginning, you can use that as your fold point to close the basket. Top stitch around the basket to close the seam. Stitch under the handles to keep them moving freely. Remove any basting stitches on the body of the bag, and remember you can keep the bottom stitching in place. Now your basket is complete and ready to be filled up. I used extra fabric and the tassels from my original table runner to make a name tag for the Easter basket. I hope you enjoyed this project and it's inspired you to make your own version. Thank you so much for watching.